You can't have an aviation show without talking about the Air Force. Today in the hangar. Hi, I'm Dan Milliken.
And I'm Christy Wong. And today's episode of In the Hangar is brought to you by Wingfield Aviation,
A trusted source for your aircraft maintenance needs. Give them a call. Who do we have today?
We have Captain Jessica Krause.
Captain Krause, thank you so much for coming out. You are the Public Affairs Officer for what used to be called Carswell. I know it as Carswell.
Yes, a lot of folks still know it as Carswell, but I am actually the Public Affairs Officer for the 301st Fighter Wing here in Fort Worth, Texas. It is a long name now, but we are now primarily a naval air station, and of course we are a tenant.
Which is kind of weird because, you know, when we're flying around, I fly out of Hicks, which is right by the Naval Air Station. And so you got Navy over here and Meacham over there. Sure. Navy, 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 but you're the Air Force.
Yes, and we have the biggest footprint, actually.
Oh, really?
So on the base, of course.
That's interesting.
They should call it we should be calling it Air Force, not Navy,
Not
right?
Navy, yeah.
Hey, you know, it's wasn't us.
It wasn't your call.
I feel like we could start something here.
Yeah, let's start something.
It is really interesting because not only are we a tenant, so the 301st Fighter Wing, but we also have our guard counterparts, and we also have our numbered Air Force, which is the 10th, our next, chain of command.
Well, speaking of which, so I have no clue. I know that in the Army that you go from squad to platoon to company to battalion to division.
Yes.
A fighter wing, how does that fit in the hierarchy? Yeah.
So I was actually in the Army first. So trust me, it took me
wow.
a minute transitioning between the Army and the Air Force as an officer because there are differences. Some of the ranks are kind of interestingly the same, but they're not. So at any rate, yes. So basically what the reg says is for the wing that it's 2 or more groups. And so the lowest level starts at, you can go all the way down to just a team, to a squadron, to a group. It can go all the way up to wing, then the numbered Air Force, the MAGCOM, so the major part, the region, which ours is AFRC, and it can go even further than that. So all the way to the Secretary of the Air Force.
Okay.
Wow.
So how many airplanes in a squadron?
I think it varies. So depending, and that'd be something I'd have to ask one of our pilots because it does vary from squadron to squadron to wing to wing. I think currently, actually, I don't know. I'd have to ask our pilot.
Right.
Actually, how many we have currently because I can't remember. But in any rate, so it really varies based on the mission requirements and what we need to actually accomplish.
Okay. I want to know how you got involved. You're so cool. So you started with the Army and now you're in the Air Force. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So my path, and this is something that can go along with the myths, but my path wasn't traditional. So I didn't wake up one day and say, I'm going to join the Air Force, although both of my parents are veterans. So my dad actually served in the Air Force. He retired as a chief. He actually did 6 tours between Iraq and Afghanistan.
Wow.
So I grew up with that, seeing my dad gone and that was especially in the height of 9/11. It was pretty common, pretty quick and furious for him. But in any rate, I looked at going to college, and I thought about joining the military, didn't have my heart set on one branch or anything in particular. Looked at and applied to the Army and the Air Force because it was between those two that I really was looking at, and I actually got a national scholarship from Army ROTC. So when you get selected, I was 17 at the time, you sign your contract and they tell you where you go to college. And so,
wow.
yeah, so that's how it went from my story. And I went
What
to
college?
Fresno State is where my undergrad's from. And
Awesome.
so I did that, and I actually commissioned into law enforcement. So I was a military police officer in the Army.
Wow.
So kind of different from aviation, although you fly in like Chinooks and Blackhawks and stuff, but it's not really the same as the Air Force. But so I did that first, and I did policing pretty much all the way coming into the Air Force, actually. So a combination of active duty, reserve time, came over into the Air Force Reserves as a cop and was looking for something different. I've done it for so long, and being a military police investigator, doing different tasks, and fell into public affairs and the Air Force and aviation, and just have loved it ever since.
Wow. So did you fulfill your contract with the Army and then you kind of transitioned over to the Air Force afterwards?
So initially it was 4 years of active duty that you had to serve, 4 years of IRR, which is like the inactive reserves, or guard, or you can go guard or reserves. So I did my whole time pretty much in the Army anyway, because I was about 7 years in when I ended up transitioning. It was a very difficult process for anybody that's thinking about that, to go from an officer, because we are essentially appointed by whichever service, the secretary of whichever service we are in. So I had to go all the way through the Secretary of the Army, and it was a whole process to come over to the Air Force.
And to keep your commission.
Of course. Mhm.
Right.
So you essentially resign your commission to gain the new one, although you keep your service time and all that. So
It's so
it was yeah,
interesting.
it's definitely different.
Was it something you wanted to do, or was it something that was an opportunity that more presented itself?
It just kind of presented itself. So at the time, I was a reservist at the time when I made the switch, and I was actually working for LAPD, the Los Angeles Police Department. So I was in a really great role there, and there was not a close Army unit at the time that had a police billet, so a law enforcement billet. So I kind of fell into coming into the Air Force that way. And of course, my dad was in as well, so I had that push as well.
Was he in at the same time?
He was,
And
yes.
so you outranked your dad.
I did. It was he actually.
That was the awkward Thanksgiving dinners.
Yes, he still reminds me that he's a chief and that he outranks me even though he's retired.
Right.
But he was OSI, Office of Special Investigation, so law enforcement as well.
Oh, wow.
And so he retired in 2013, but he was my first salute. So if you know the traditions of when you commission and the ceremony, he was my first salute and my silver dollar.
Oh, wow. I don't know what a silver dollar is.
It's a tradition that when you commission, you get a silver dollar from the highest ranking person that salutes you, or
That's pretty
So
cool.
and of course mine was interesting because of course my dad knew me because it's not always a
Right.
family member. So my silver dollar had my birth year on it, and so something kind of neat. Yeah,
That's
it was really neat.
That's pretty cool. Okay, so why aviation for you then?
So again, I kind of fell into it, and I will say, being in the Army versus the Air Force is an interesting switch, right? So the Army has its own culture and the camaraderie is different. And in the Air Force, I get amazed every day, especially what I do. So being a public affairs officer, I tell the Air Force story or airman story. And it's amazing to me to see, especially some of our younger airmen out there, and they just love what they do. You know,
You don't see that in the Army?
well, you do, but it's not the same. It's the dedication. So in the Army, it's more of the dedication to the mission. You just see
Right.
I'm going to do this because I'm dedicated to my mission. But the intrinsic side in the Air Force is quite different. And there was an incident recently where I ended up going to visit one of our squadrons, and I was so impressed. We have, of course, since we have the F-16s, they do have missiles, and so we have folks that make that happen. And it was amazing to me watching. There was some 18-year-old airman, and how excited he was to tell me about what he does and how he builds and puts this together for our F-16s to make the mission happen. And it was more than just, hey, I'm doing a job, but wow, this is my life, and this is amazing. And you don't see that as much in the Army. I mean, it's there. I mean, there's folks like that everywhere, but it's very amazing to see that.
Well, aviation will do that. It's a
yeah.
special world.
A lot of folks
Special.
love it.
Okay, you mentioned earlier the myths. What are some of the most common myths or misunderstandings about the Air Force?
I think the first one, and the biggest one across all the services, is that everyone flies. So we get that a lot. So I get asked a lot if I fly. I will tell you, I'll openly admit that I was very afraid of heights when I came in. And so I actually was assigned first to a heavy unit, so heavier aircrafts, the KC-135 and the C-17. And the first couple times I went up even in those, I was like, oh my God, what's gonna happen? You know, it was still very daunting to me. So that's a common misconception that comes along, that we all fly. Although I will say a lot of our airmen, they do have private pilot's license, or they're involved in other ways in the aviation industry. So, and obviously since we're reservists, some folks are actually working for some of the big folks out there, like, your different affiliate airlines as well. So you can get that as well. So that's a huge one. So not everyone's a pilot. They may have the private license, but they're not everyone. We have a lot of folks that make the mission happen. So my wing currently, we have about 2,200 airmen, a mixture of active duty, active guard reserve. Myself, I'm an air reserve technician, so I hold a federal status, and kind of a mixture of folks that come together to make the mission happen. And their pilot community is really tiny. I mean, I think we have maybe, I'd have to again check with my pilot counterpart, but I think it's around 60. I mean, it's very small. So that's a huge one. I think the other one is the female footprint. So you get a lot of folks that think, especially when I was in the Army, they'd say there's not a lot of females out there, and that's not true. It is, of course, certain career fields do attract more females than others, or certain genders, I would say, but predominantly we definitely have more females, and I think we're at an all-time high for female participation in the
That's
units.
awesome.
Yeah, in my career field, and particularly as public affairs officer, we have 185 officers in public affairs currently, and I'd say at least half of them are female. So
Wow.
it is definitely a calling that people find. And I think the other myth is the service, the amount of service that we have. How many folks in the nation, right, can and are able to serve? And the short answer is less than 1%. And I think the Veterans Affairs, they did a study last year that discussed that. I mean, they went through all the data, and only 7% of living Americans have served in one of the military forces.
I didn't realize it was that low.
It is very low.
Okay, so that's common. Now, you're with the 301st, 301st, and tell me some of the history of the 301st.
So the wing has been around a long time. So as you mentioned earlier, of course, we've been known before about being Carswell. So we get that a lot. We joke sometimes that we call it the USS Carswell because of course we have the Navy Navy piece there, and so yeah. So we definitely have a rich history. We were formed in 1944, and the F-16s. That's another maybe misconception that comes along, is how long we've had the F-16s, and we've only had them. I say only, but since 1991, and we are looking at potentially transitioning here shortly as well. So there's
Transitioning.
so I will say I can't. So I'll go into that a little bit. But our wing, the 301st Fighter Wing, I'd say we're the premier fighter wing. We are a premier fighter wing in the Air Force Reserve, especially because of our mission and the different components to that. We are the preferred location for the F-35. So we are being looked at currently for that aircraft. So we will know for sure.
Yeah.
The record of decision will come down here in August-September timeframe from the Secretary of the Air Force, whether or not that transition will be a reality. It's really, really great opportunity to even be considered for such an opportunity. We are being looked at along with Homestead in Florida, Whiteman in Missouri, and Davis-Monthan in Tucson, Arizona.
Okay, so for the 301st, if a transition happens, pretty much every single pilot that's now flying F-16 goes into a transition to the F-35, or do you have to they'll get shipped off to another F-16 wing and you bring in other pilots? How does that work?
So the plan would be, and from history, looking at other wings in the past that have done similar, they will be given the option. So the pilot can decide whether or not they want to transition. It's a little shorter than being, of course,
Okay. Do you want to fly F-16, which is incredible, or do you want to go to the F-35, which is almost just one step short of going to the moon? How would you say no to that?
So, some pilots are considering, maybe because they're at the tail end of their career, or they're looking at, okay, maybe do I really want to go through training? And it's different from somebody off the street who starts the whole process and being selected and goes through F-35 training versus somebody that's already a seasoned F-16 pilot and they're transitioning in that regard. So
Okay,
it's
and I
just a
guess too,
course, it's a
once you start doing it for years and years and you have 1,000 hours, and maybe it's the novelty of pulling 9Gs wears off. I don't know.
Well, the difference is the fourth generation versus fifth generation aircraft. So there is a generational difference. And yeah, our counterpart, so Lockheed actually manufactures them, and they're actually testing them currently here in Fort Worth, the F-35.
Wow.
So there's definitely some information out there to be discovered about the capabilities of those aircrafts. And interestingly enough, so our wing also being, again, very, very different than most. So we do have a group, the 44th Fighter Group, that is an F-22 unit. So they are currently displaced. So
they're part of your wing.
They are. So they are under us, which is kind of different because they're not geographically located with us. And they were actually impacted by Hurricane Michael, so they're currently displaced in Florida. But of course, amazing mission, especially with a different jet as well, the F-22, and those capabilities that go with that.
You talk about amazing mission, and you've used the word mission several times. The F-16, the 301st, what is the mission?
Our mission is to train and deploy combat-ready airmen. That's what everything that we do is of course, to have air superiority. So we talk about air superiority, lethality, and that ability to make the imprint on the world.
Oh, that's incredible. So what does the future look like for you, Captain Krause?
With the F-35 potential, or myself?
No, yourself.
Okay.
I want to know about you.
Oh, sure. Well, I will say I'm very excited. I just got here in October. I was living in Los Angeles, and I was assigned to a mobility wing before. So this has been an exciting time for me right now. I'm just happy to be here. Texas has been amazing.
Texas is awesome. Welcome,
I am
by the
so
way.
happy to be here, I will tell you. It's been welcoming. It's the cultural and the worldview differences they've been amazing. But I definitely am excited excited to be a part of history that may be happening here in the short future. And I think that's going to hold a lot for myself, my career, and also my peers and my fellow airmen.
So you intend to stay for a while?
Yes, so I'm planning to be here for at least the next couple of years. So our career field is different because we do specialized assignments. So realistically, I'd probably have to take an assignment eventually at either our headquarters in Warner Robins, Georgia, or to the Pentagon for my next.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting, it's different. It's like, again, when you look at the Army versus the Air Force, the Army tells you this scripted of way, like you're going to lead in command. But then in the Air Force, it can be different. So there's so many opportunities out there and ways to serve. A lot of airmen that we have in my wing, they actually are prior service, whether that meant they were prior enlisted or they had a prior job like myself. And we have literally the best total force airmen that the Air Force can ever even imagine to have.
Wow, that's incredible.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and
Thank you.
sharing about the Air
Thanks for
Force. And
Yeah, and thank you so much for your service.
thank you
to
so
our
much,
country.
both
This
y'all.
is
Thank you,
amazing.
Captain.
Thank you.
And thank you guys for watching. And as always, please like, share, subscribe.
And we'll see you next time in the hangar.